Another, and pray that our time together might be honoring to you, so that we might take what we have to learn and put it into practice in our lives. Be with those that are sick or struggling in whatever way, so that they might be able to be healed and be with us at the next appointed time. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. We got a little bit of a cold going around our house right now. We're all sharing it amongst each other, so if I'm a little low or not as charismatic, I should say, that's because we got sniffles going around our house. So, um, but First Samuel chapter 1 is where we're going to be today. First Samuel chapter 1, or 1 Samuel, if you'd like to refer to it in that way. We're continuing to study the women of the Old Testament. But in this opening chapter of the book of First Samuel, we read the story of a woman who, at least for part of her life, led a difficult life in her service to God. But even though this is the case, she continued to faithfully serve God and continued to rely on God with those difficulties that she faced, and she was blessed because of it. Now, this woman who I'm referring to, who endured difficulty but was blessed for it, is the woman named Hannah. Hannah, even though she faced great difficulty, God blessed her and helped her overcome these difficulties by blessing her with a son named Samuel, the the person from whom this book gets its name. And as we're going to see, she persistently prayed while she endured these difficulties. She was mocked by another woman who mocked her because she initially could not have children until the Lord blessed her with Samuel. So these are some of the things we're going to be studying today from the text of just chapter 1. We're going to spend all our time here in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel, and we're going to look at several points from various verses of this chapter. From the first verse, we will see that Hannah was initially barren. We'll talk about that. And then the next point we'll look at from the second verse is that Hannah had a rival. From the next passage we'll look at, we'll see that fact that Hannah was persistent in prayer. We'll see also that she was oppressed in spirit. And finally, from the last passage we'll look at, we'll see that Hannah dedicated her child to the Lord. Now, after looking at these things, we will see that Hannah was a woman who sacrificed much in her service to God, and that we ought to do the same, be willing to make sacrifices in our own service to God. So we're going to start in verse 5 of this chapter, where the text says, but to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. Now we're going to give that some context, but the point here is introduced in the first part of this verse, that Hannah would receive what the text calls a double portion because she was loved. Now, again, just giving that some context. As we come to this verse, what brings us to this point is the fact that in the opening verses of this chapter, the author is setting the scene for this chapter. He's told us about Hannah's husband, Elkanah. He was also married to a second wife, and when they would go up to sacrifice, he would give them portions of that sacrifice, but as the text says, to Hannah he would give a double portion. Why? Why would he give her a double portion according to this verse? He loved her, and yes, there was definitely the idea of favoring there. But something else we should know about this word loved, I've shared this with you before. In the Old Testament, the word loved, it refers to having a great affection for someone, and there is also the idea of loyalty involved in this word loved. But this is how Elkanah, her husband, felt about her. It's just he was very loyal to her. He had a great affection for her, and yes, there was some idea of favoring her as well. So, going on to the second part of the verse, the author concludes this verse by saying that the Lord had closed her womb. Now, can anyone tell me what that means, that the Lord had closed her womb? She wasn't having children. Okay, that's definitely part of the idea. Are there any other ideas on the closed her womb? How's the Lord involved in this? Okay, he's in control. So yeah, basically the Lord was not allowing her to have children for whatever reason. And so this is where we get the idea that she was essentially barren. She could not have children, at least not at this point in her life. And this is one of the main reasons that Elkanah had a great love for her. So we have to ask the question, why would her husband love her so much in spite of this fact? How are the two connected? I know that's not an easy question to answer. I'm just picking brains. Okay? Sarah. That's true. Yeah, that's true. We don't know for certain. Okay. So so yeah, that's we can't know. We can't know why Elkanah loved her in spite of this fact, but there might have been some compassion there. All we're told in this verse is that he loved Hannah apparently more than the other wife and gave her this double portion. But the point we're seeing about Hannah here is that she was barren. At this point in her life, she could not have children. We also know that she was greatly loved by her husband, and the fact that she would receive this double portion of his sacrifices to God. And so, even though Hannah could not have children, she was still loved. And this is a big deal in this culture where having children was very important. Yeah, we're in 1 Samuel chapter 1. So this brings us to the second point about Hannah. We're just going to move right along in the text there into verses 6 and 7, if somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses. Yeah, 1 Samuel 1, 6 and 7. Thank you, Andrew. So, next point we're going to look at about Hannah is that she had what the text calls a rival. Does anyone have a different word than rival there in verse 6? No? Okay. What's a rival? Someone you compete with? Okay. Any other ideas? All right. Someone you compete with, definitely. Um, we could also say it refers to an enemy, but what I want to point out here is that this is another instance where the Neo American Standard has done us a disservice. And I say that because this word rival, it doesn't come from a word that we think of as a rival. It actually comes from a word that can also refer to a second wife. But our translators have translated in this way because of what this woman was doing to Hannah. So the idea is there, but it's not specifically the word for rival. But so that with that in mind, what was this woman doing to Hannah according to this verse? But that's true. Well, what does the text say that she was doing? Provoking her. You could say that. Right. That's it would be. But the text uses this language of it says her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly. Now, what does it mean to provoke someone? Exactly. That's the idea here is she's setting out to make her angry for the purpose of irritating her, the text says. So, setting out to make her angry, annoy her. She is being childish, and the text doesn't give us specific reasons, but this is what she's doing. And the text also adds that she's doing it bitterly. She is setting out to hurt Hannah in the way that is described in this verse. Now we know that because the word bitterly here, it comes from a word that has the sense of doing something in a hurtful or unfriendly manner. And so this is why we have the word rival, because she's basically an enemy of Hannah, even though they're both married to the same person, but that's just the culture that existed at this time. Anything else on verse 6? He's loving Hannah more. Yeah, yeah. That's understandable. We might be able to see where she might be coming from. Anything else on verse 6? Yeah, that's verse 5. Right. Yeah, it would be devastating. Yeah, absolutely. So this is what she's rubbing in her face, the fact that she can't have children, but there also might be the reason that in spite of that she was loved more by Elkanah. So going on to verse 7, how often did this happen? According to verse 7, year after year. And then the text also adds that she went up to the house of the Lord. Um, the thought is repeated, she would provoke her, so she wept and would not eat. So, what the author records here carries with it the idea that Peninnah, who's the name of this second wife, did these things to Hannah, what we might call on an annual basis, when they would go to the house of the Lord. Now, what's Hannah's response to this, according to this verse? She would weep and not eat. She'd refuse to partake in meals that were associated with this time that they would go up to worship. So, as a result, furthermore, one possible reason Peninnah would do these things on this occasion is because, according to some research I did, it was at this time that people would receive essentially rewards for their blessings, such as children. So, as a result, when Peninnah would receive her rewards, she'd also say hurtful things toward Hannah for not receiving those rewards that came with having children. And so Hannah would weep, and she would refuse to eat during these meals that would be served on occasions like this. Questions or comments on verse 7? All right. So we're putting the focus on Hannah. What we see here, excuse me, is that she had a rival. She had what we might call an enemy, and her enemy was this woman, Peninnah. Now, the author has also shown that the reason Peninnah functioned as Hannah's enemy is because Peninnah would provoke her, irritate Hannah, and this caused her to weep and refuse to eat. So, jumping forward, we're going to move into our next point. We're going to see more of how Hannah responded to this, but we're going to jump down to verse 12, where we're going to see her persistence in prayer. Now, if somebody wouldn't mind reading that, verse 12. All right, we'll pause there. So as we come to this verse, what is Hannah doing? How often? Continually. Text says she continued praying for the Lord. Now, when you continue doing something, what are you doing? All the time. Always doing it. This is part of her response to how she's being treated, is she's praying. Now, again, giving this some context, what brings us to this point is that after the things described in 6 and 7 that we just looked at, in verse 8, Elkanah, her husband, asked her, "Why are you weeping? Why are you not eating? Why is your heart sad?" Just kind of a series of questions. In response to this, in verses 9 through 11, Hannah, instead of answering those questions, next thing Hannah does is pray. And then we're introduced to this priest named Eli. But as she's praying, before we reach verse 12, she also wept bitterly. She's very sad. So what she does is she makes a vow to God that if God would remember her and bless her with a child, she would dedicate that child to the Lord. And those verses also say that a razor would never come to his head, and this bears resemblance to the Nazirite vow that Samson was under in the book of Judges, but that's just a side note. So by the time we reach verse 12, Hannah is praying this prayer. Who's watching her? Eli, the priest. But the focus here is on the fact that Hannah was a woman of prayer. She's getting treated badly. She's going through all these things. Her response is to pray. And not just to pray continually. She was persistent in prayer. She was what we might call a woman of prayer. It's seeing the fact that she continually prayed for her child, that God might bless her with a child, I should say. Now, what this also indicates about Hannah is that she was a woman of great faith. She sincerely believed in what we might call the power of prayer, where we're laying at God's feet the things we're struggling with and trusting that He will provide what we need in the midst of those struggles. Struggles that might cause us to weep bitterly. So that's verse 12. Questions or comments? Right. Right. And Scripture does teach being persistent in prayer no matter what the circumstance. I don't remember the exact passage, but Jesus tells the story, a parable, of an unrighteous judge who refused to help a woman because he was just not a good guy. But this woman keeps asking. Now, Jesus tells that story not to say that God's an unrighteous judge, because he is, but to say that we too should be persistent in prayer. I believe it's in Luke, but I'm not sure. So that's the kind of woman Hannah was, that she would continue to pray, even in spite of the things she was going through. So that brings us into the fourth point about Hannah that we'll see from verse 15 of this verse or chapter, we'll see that she was oppressed in spirit. Now, if somebody wouldn't mind reading verse 15. All right, thank you, Helene. So here we're finding another statement from Hannah. She's answering a question, and the question being the one from Eli in verse 14, where it says, Then Eli said to her, How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. Now, jumping back to verse 14 for just a moment, what's Eli thinking at this point? She's intoxicated. So we have to ask why he believes this. That's where verse 13 comes in. It says, As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, but only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Now we've looked at verse 12. She's praying. But what's going on in verse 13? How is she praying? Okay. Right. She's not speaking the words out loud, but her lips are moving. So this causes Eli to think, well, she's drunk. Now, why would he think that? Okay, he looked at the outward appearance, but why think she's drunk? Just based on the fact that her lips are moving, but she's not saying anything. I know. Right. Right. It's not the usual circumstance, and this is so. He thinks she's drunk because she's just moving her lips. She's not saying anything, and so well, something's not right. He comes to that conclusion. So he asked Hannah this question from verse 14: or how long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. Which how does she answer? We're back to verse 15. She was right. So she says, "No, my lord, I am not. I don't have any of this. I'm not under the influence of any of this." Sorry, I lost my words there for a second. But she addresses him as Lord. That's the first thing I want us to notice here. Why use the word Lord here? Because it was the priest. So this isn't Lord God. This is just it's a term of respect. In certain contexts, the word Lord it's just used as a term of respect. It's the equivalent of what we might call a man sir. So yes, he's the priest. She recognizes his authority, so she's just being respectful. So what else does she tell Eli? What's her circumstance? Okay, you have troubled in spirit. The New American Standard has oppressed in spirit. They're virtually the same thing. What does it mean to be troubled or oppressed in spirit? Okay, deeply grieved is definitely part of the idea here. But even more specifically than that, it's the idea that she felt spiritually burdened. Troubled or oppressed, it just means you're burdened by something. But in this case, it's on the level of your spirit. Now, what's she been dealing with up to this point? Exactly. All the things we've talked about. She's being mocked, being hurt. She's going through all these things, all because she can't have a child. And so she's troubled. This is becoming very difficult for her because, as far as we know, this had been going on for years. And so she tells Eli, I'm spiritually burdened. Now, again, that's just paraphrasing. But then she goes on to tell him, I've drunk neither wine nor strong drink. Here's what I'm doing. Now, in that last part of the verse, what is she doing? If she's not drinking, what's she doing? Besides praying. Pouring out her soul. Ever done that? Poured out your soul? What does that mean? That's it. You're just letting it all out. Now, you might do that with a person. In this case, it's in your relationship with God. And a lot of this is where the weeping is coming from, because she's just letting it all out. But she's not verbalizing any of it. Her lips are moving. That's what Eli is seeing. But she's pouring out her soul on the level of her spirit. So with that being true, this brings us to my previous question. I think it's at this point that we should understand is that one reason Eli may have believed Hannah to be drunk is because at this time the drinking of things like wine were common at the times that people would go to make their sacrifices to God. So some people would go a little overboard and have the appearance that Hannah did, but Hannah says, no, I'm not under the influence of wine or strong drink. I'm pouring out my soul before God. But the reason she did this, and I think that's the point we need to see about Hannah, is that she was oppressed in spirit. She had endured great difficulty. This was inevitably trying her faith to some degree. And the reason she had endured great spiritual difficulty is because of what this other woman was doing to her as a result of Hannah not being able to have children. But her response, as we've seen before, is to pray, but also to pour out her soul in prayer. That initially causes Eli to believe she was drunk, but after her conversation with him, Eli is corrected. And in verse 17 of this chapter, this causes Eli to give Hannah a word of blessing and a wish that God might grant her request to have a child. Anything else on this verse before we go to our last point? All right. We're going to go to our last point in verses 27 and 28 of this chapter, the closing verses of this chapter. Somebody wouldn't mind reading those. Okay, thanks, Dad. So what's happened at this point? She's had a baby. Why? What's the text say? God granted it to her, and the text uses the word petition. I was glad it was in his translation. What's a petition? Okay, it's a request. It's a firm request where it's basically she's been begging God, as we've already seen. So what brings us to this point is that after her conversation with Eli, Hannah's been able to get over her sadness to some degree. She finally eats. Then her and her family worship the Lord, following a time when she and Elkanah engage in relations. God remembers Hannah's prayer and allows her to conceive, and she gives birth to a boy. The boy named Samuel, and she named him Samuel because she recognized that she asked for this boy from the Lord. Then Elkanah returns to worship, the following year, we might assume. But Hannah doesn't go because she wanted to wait until the child was weaned before she would give him over into service to the Lord. So she keeps her promise and offers a sacrifice to God and gives her son over to Eli so that the boy might be forever dedicated in service to the Lord. So it's for this reason that she says here in verse 27. It's the idea that she prayed for this boy and asked this boy from God. But then verse 28. Verse 28, she makes another statement which acknowledges the fact that because God had granted to Hannah her request, the New American Standard has she has now dedicated him to the Lord. And as long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord, followed by the author recording Eli's worship to the Lord. But I noticed Dad's translation uses the word Lent. That's probably a better translation because this word dedicated in the New American Standard, it does come from a word that means Lent. Now, when something is lent to someone, what does that mean? Okay, they're going to return it. It's on loan. That's more specifically the idea here. Literally speaking, it's the idea that Hannah has allowed God to borrow her son. Looking at it from the other side of that coin. But for how long is God, quote unquote, borrowing Samuel? As long as he lives. His whole life. So, what we're beginning to see here is that Hannah has essentially sacrificed her son, not killed him on an altar, but given him over to God for his whole life. Lifelong service to God alongside Eli. And this is how the story of Samuel begins, but that's a different study. But she sacrificed her son to God in that way. And the response is that Eli worships. Questions or comments on those two verses? Yeah, absolutely. She kept her vow to God in dedicating her child to the Lord. And this is her firstborn. So it is also demonstrated here is the fact that Hannah was a woman who was faithful in her service to God. She fulfilled her vow. And God was worshipped because Hannah had done what she vowed to do. So putting all this together, the point we should see about Hannah is that she sacrificed much to God. She went through all this difficulty because of her barrenness. She put up with a rival. She was persistent in prayer. We also see that she was oppressed in spirit, and she finally dedicated or lent her child to the Lord. So that's the application to us, is there are those times we're going to have to make sacrifices in our relationship with God. That doesn't mean to sacrifice something. To give it up. So we're going to have to give some things up in our relationship with God when the situation calls for it. It might be our time, might be our money, any number of things that we might be able to think of. Hannah did this. She was a woman who gave up her status as a wife who could have children. If you were a wife at this time, it was very important to have children. But she was still loved even though she couldn't. But she gave up her status as a wife to be able to do what she did. But God eventually allowed her to have a child, and she gave that child up. That was something else she sacrificed. So as a result of these things, what this should encourage us to do is examine what are we willing to sacrifice to be more pleasing to God. What did Jesus sacrifice for us? His life. So that tells us that we ought to be willing to sacrifice even our very lives, if that's what the situation calls for. Any other questions or comments? Exactly. She never let go of that faith. Anything else? All right. Well, that's First Samuel chapter 1 in a nutshell. I hope it's been helpful. Matt, will you close us today?